I can talk about a whole bunch of stuff that I do and the kinds of things that I do on my day-to-day basis. I actually don't do open source day-to-day. Or I could write a game in about 40 minutes. I don't know which one you want me to do. Or I can just sit here and talk to you guys about stuff, ask you questions and...
Write a game in 40 minutes.
You want me to write a game in 40 minutes? Yeah?
No, that takes too long now.
I'm happy to do it because I'm just trying to procrastinate the fact that I have to drive to Boston tonight. So, so I'm happy to do 40 minutes. Yeah.
So open source at Microsoft, that one's new to me.
Damn it! Hoping you would go for the game. Yeah, in fact, I've actually got a sticker on my laptop as well, which I realised I had yesterday. The Microsoft Bridge Initiative, that's the logo. We actually have a bunch of stuff with open source, and I really am happy to talk about this stuff. It's not something I normally do. So first, I'm an academic developer evangelist. That means I actually go around talking to students and talking to faculty about developer and designer tools, and talk about curriculum. I talk about research projects. I talk about things like getting free software for you guys, getting you involved in really exciting things like Imagine Cup competition, and a whole bunch of stuff like that. Mr. Andy Puppy, that's not M. Randy Puppy for you dirty-minded people. It's Mr. Andy Puppy. That's my Twitter, Facebook, Xbox, anything else. So you can get in touch with me that way. I do have some business cards if you want to get in touch with me through email or whatever. Traditionally, people look at Microsoft and say we're not open, but we have become a lot more open recently in the last 5 years or so. And just a couple of sort of myths about open source that I like to sort of look at. The myth is that open source is in the public domain. The fact is copyright is maintained. It's retained by whoever's writing that. There's implicit copyright, there's explicit copyright, and it exists in open source. Open source is just freeware or shareware. Well, it's got to be clear, open source is free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. Now, before Microsoft, I used to be a journalist. I wrote an article about 10, 11 years ago now called not free beer, free speech, not free beer. And it was all about the open source community and whether people actually wanted stuff for free or whether they actually wanted to be able to do stuff with a sort of open license. And I find a lot of people that buy into open source actually do it because they just want everything else for free, not there, right? In fact, I actually used to work with a guy, we were both lead developers on our respective projects at Intuit, and he was completely mad about open source. And I was and he was saying, everything's open source. I said, yeah, but you're working at Intuit, which is a very commercial company, on a product, QuickBooks, which is sold for a lot of money. What are you doing? He said, well, everything else should be free, right? The operating system should be free, the developer tool should be free. And they go, what about your work? He goes, well, no, I want to have my work paid for, right? So I actually challenged him on that and said, well, if you really do believe in the open source mentality, methodology, philosophy, you should really consider what you're doing. And he resigned the next day. The other thing is, a really big myth is nobody enforces open source rights. That, hey, it's just completely free to use, and if you kind of infringe on one of the licenses, no one's really going to bother. Open source litigation is massively active in the last couple of years. So just be aware of that if you are going to use open source, go with the right license and be careful about what licensing you're using. So with Microsoft, we actually do look at open source. We use open source internally, and I have to go through a lot of reviews about what I use because of all those sort of things like litigation and stuff. But we actually have been listening to our customers, and we're actually looking at things like the cloud and stuff where we can actually really be super open and interoperate. So we actually have a whole bunch of these sorts of places, technologies and companies that you will recognize that we actually interact with. There's only like one Linux flavor that I can think of that we don't like, because they don't like us. But yeah, we actually have an open source technology center. We actually have like 300 or 400 people working in open source. That's their full-time job, open source stuff. and we look at things like integrating Hyper-V with Linux and stuff like that. We are a platinum sponsor of Apache, one of the top 3, and we are contributing to the open source community all the time. Just some highlights there: the device driver code for Linux to be able to connect to some stuff, Hyper-V Linux stuff, as I mentioned before, CoAP and things like that. In fact, in Linux 3.0, the top individual contributor is a guy that works at Microsoft, and Microsoft is actually the 5th largest corporate contributor into the Linux 3.0 kernel and stuff. So we are actively involved in open source. Okay. We actually have our own open source project code site called Codeplex.com. Highly recommend it if you actually do use our tools and our software, because as you can see there's thousands of plugins and projects and open sourced content that you can use if you're diving into Visual Studio and C# and other things like that. It's very, very active, and you'll find a whole bunch of stuff there. Microsoft.com/web is where, have you guys heard of Microsoft WPI, the Web Platform Installer, before? So it's basically a free installer. You can see it, this is kind of it running now. And it lets you install, very easily configure ASP.NET onto your computer, but also other technologies that are not ours, and a lot of them are open source. So you can't really see it there, but there's WordPress, there's Umbraco CMS, there's things like Joomla and other open source CMSs that are all in there, and you basically can just checkbox the things that you want to install, click go, and it'll just go off and download the right packages and install it all onto your machine for you. You can see it's very active. Since January last year, we've had 2 million downloads, and we've actually increased the number of applications on there to over 70 now. We actually contribute to a number of different open source projects. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can just see there's a big list there. This is just actually a small subset of what we actually do. And we actually see that open source, of the top 25 most downloaded open source projects, 23 of them actually run on the Windows platform. They may run on the other platforms as well, but I'm just saying it's completely doable to run stuff on Windows if you live in an open source world.
What are the other 2?
I actually don't know what the other 2 are. I live in the Windows world. We support a number of standards. We work on standards bodies. We're part of standards bodies. You can see, you know, I'm not going to name those because a lot of those are just going to be names that you talk about all the time. These are some of the open source sort of standard bodies that we work with. And again, way too many to talk about. Windows actually is a platform you should actually consider, even if you do sort of look in the open source community for stuff. There's you know, as you can see there's quite a few people and quite a few applications in that ecosystem. But if we looked at just one thing, like for instance Office, which like is something that I would never consider to be open at all. Even Office actually, you know, has open standards in its file formats. It has documentation for opening up the APIs and the protocols to work with Office. And we even went to the extent of quite a few years ago now, trying to make our default documents, even though that's completely ugly when you look at it, using sort of open standards like XML and things. You can see all these sort of standards we've got over here that we actually implement just through Office alone, that are all sort of open standards that we sort of bought into. On top of that, if we went to something that's even more commercial, even more sort of enterprise-centric, and looked at Exchange, you can see that when we implemented Exchange ActiveSync, we went open with that and said, hey, we want to make sure it runs on all the devices. So mobile devices like iOS and Android are there, and other operating systems, other servers can actually use Exchange to actually get into our stuff. Similar with the web services, and obviously webmails, we tried to make sure that it runs on all browsers, not just IE, and we don't talk about IE6, okay? You can see with Windows Server we actually provide a common support from runtime support for not just our world, like .NET, but we actually have a completely dedicated subsystem for Unix apps. We actually provide native support for things like MySQL and PHP, and Java's in there somewhere as well. And you can see that we can virtualize all of that under the Hyper-V banner. We actually have worked with Novell to provide a lot of support through the Linux system with them as well, and that's just some of their customers. And you can see that we can even go through to this sort of a mixed source where we go open source as well as closed source, and we can do this sort of thing where we're using the different sort of server stacks, having sort of parallel stuff, and you can really see that the customer-facing portal just doesn't see that sort of blending of the multi-source sort of implementation. I'm going to go through System Center. We see these kinds of things all the time, and it's helping convey the message that we really do want to be involved in open source. Things like this. Microsoft is the world's broadest supporter of Linux through all of our products. We see people saying, hey, I'd never use Windows, and then turn around and get quoted as saying Azure rocks. Right? So it's kind of because it's this open cloud solution that allows me to run all this stuff. So it's really an interesting experience. Talking about Azure, you can see that developers can use their existing skills and tools, whether it's PHP or Visual Studio or Eclipse, through the tools for Windows Azure plugin. They can then call through to the Windows Azure cloud and get advantage of all that power that's there at their disposal. We build all these interoperability bridges to connect to things. So like for Azure, for instance, there's an SDK for Java, one for PHP. There's the tools for Eclipse I mentioned already, command line tools for PHP, etc. And even to the point where you can call into Bing from PHP, or the Bing plugin for WordPress, and all that kind of goodness. We're constantly working on that. If you go to interoperabilitybridges.com, you actually can see these in action. You can see case studies and success stories about these kinds of things. I'm not going to go through that. That's a very commercial slide. But I really wanted to just highlight this URL as well, microsoft.com/openness. It's a really good base for you to actually start with if you actually still don't believe me that we are involved in open source. You can really check a lot of stuff out with that. And that's this whole bridge sort of logo. It's trying to bridge the gap between the perception of what Microsoft is and open source. And that's it. So is that all right? Is that good?
Thank you.
Cool.
So usually does Microsoft as hire many of these people who are expert software developers, open source developers?
Sorry, what's the actual question?
You're going to raffle off a job?
Raffle off the job, and you get to take many of these.
I know, unfortunately I'm not raffling off a job tonight. Look, as I said, before Microsoft I was contributing to open source projects. I definitely use a lot of open source stuff. I have, one of my main blogs is in WordPress. And as I said, as a developer, I was contributing to projects as well. I have no problem with open source. I have a problem with people using it as an exclusive philosophy and religion, just like I would have a real problem with someone using Windows as an exclusive philosophy and religion, blindly accepting that as that's the only way to do it. I think you look at all technologies and choose the right technology for the right job. Yep.
See, I guess my question is, why would Microsoft put so much time and effort into developing like the Linux operating system when it's a clear competitor to the establishment of Microsoft and like education, let's say, because it's so much cheaper to, instead of getting licensing from Microsoft, just go with a custom flavor of Linux. And if Microsoft is helping develop these Linux environments for tools, it's like essentially just competing against itself. So what's the methodology behind that?
Well, I think one of the things is you've got to recognize that we live in a heterogeneous world. It's not homogeneous. It's not, hey, as much as you can create your own little custom built Linux flavor and stuff, you're going to have to interact with other things somewhere, right? And so we want to make sure that that interaction, that interoperability is really solid so that the experience is good. Yeah, because bottom line, if something goes wrong, people will blame Microsoft for it, right? Right? They'll say, hey, it's Microsoft's fault. Well, if we can say, hey, the interoperability bridge works fine from our perspective, then that's a good story.
Microsoft may be using some version of Linux and Apache servers as a role.
Yeah.
I was told, I do not know how far this is true. Now, Hotmail was running on Apache servers and on Linux platform, but I do not know.
I don't know if that's true anymore, but it may be. I think we certainly have some of those servers around. But I think to answer your question just a little bit more, you said that it's cheaper to run a Linux server. It's actually not strictly true.
Right.
Not necessarily true is what I should say.
I mean,
because
there's hidden costs there.
there's a lot of hidden costs
Yeah.
with that, and we've got some great case studies of that kind of
Right.
stuff. And there's some slides I did actually put in here because I thought that would be too crappy, but they show, hey, 5 years ago, here are all these, here's the country of the government of Vienna, and here's this organization in Scotland, and here's this US company all going, we're going Linux, right? And then 5 years on, there's all these articles with exactly the same organizations going, yeah, we're going to Windows because Linux is too expensive. It's too hard to maintain. It's too costly to just have all that maintenance cost. So you got to be careful in saying one's cheaper than the other. I'm not saying initial outlay. Yeah, sure, you're buying Windows servers, right?
Because Microsoft is so. It looks like you guys are actively developing. Really extremely actively developing this.
As I said, we've got
kernel.
hundreds of developers that's their job, open source stuff.
Right. So I mean, do Microsoft employees have the job where they get to directly work on the Linux kernel?
Yeah.
So Microsoft is working on.
That's why that guy's the top
product?
contributor, because that's his job.
Right.
He works in the Linux kernel.
That's all. Wow.
That's all he does.
That just doesn't. I guess I'm not understanding how you can pay somebody to work on for your company when you're working on a direct competitor.
Well, a lot of the stuff he'll be working in is the interoperability, making sure it's going to run through Hyper-V or sort of other app servers and other things. But definitely, it's an interesting process.
Yeah.
But it's the same as,
cool.
hey, let's make sure Exchange works with iPhone, right? iPhone is a massive problem for us,
Yeah.
right? If I'm going to be completely honest, right? And Android in the mobile space, 42, 43% of penetration. That's just stupid numbers, right? But we support it and we expose it so that Exchange can run through that operating system. Yeah.
So I've been hearing a bunch of stuff about Windows 8 Secure Boot, and
I can't talk about Windows 8.
what?
I can't talk about Windows 8.
Can't talk about Windows 8 at all?
No.
No.
I've got a major gag order on me to not talk about Windows 8.
Okay.
Which is really, really stupid and really, really frustrating, right? Because, hey, we had Build, like a week-long conference on Windows 8 where everyone could just dial in and watch the presentations live, right? I watched them live too. And then we have people in the community, we have user groups running stuff that they're allowed to talk about it, we're not. It's just because we just want to make sure the communication is passed through clearly through the Windows 8 blog and stuff. I would advise you to have a look at that, and that's the only way I can really recommend to talk about that.
Last couple of questions. We are nerds, but not nerd enough to stay past 5:30.
Seriously, I can stay for hours. Can I just really quickly just cover a couple of these things?
No,
Just really seriously.
no, we also have to leave. Oh, you want to cover something?
Yeah, just 2 minutes.
Okay.
Alright. Imagine Cup. Anyone heard of Imagine Cup? Like 2 people? Imagine Cup is the world's biggest technology competition for students. It's made for students like you guys. Alright? Now, we have 2 big, massive competitions within it, software design and game design. I actually run game design worldwide because gaming is my passion. And we have other categories as well, like the IT challenge for the network and sysadmin guys, and sometimes it's digital media, sometimes it's robotics. They're all kind of a bit random, but the 2 dedicated tracks, software design and game design. And we challenge you guys to form teams of up to 4 people and make a solution around technology. We do actually ask you to use Microsoft technology, but it's not exclusive. So you could run it on Windows Server and have it integrated into iPhone and Android if you want, or you can have, like one guy one team created a solution that was Windows Server backend, but it was all SMS text front end, right, for third world country. So You can use whatever kind of blend of technologies you want. We just have a requirement that you use at least some Microsoft technology. Gaming, there's 2 tracks. You can build games for phone, you can build games for Windows or Xbox. I have just been teaching students all over the state how to make games for Xbox and phone, which is what I would have done in 45 minutes for you guys. Totally happy to do that some other time for you guys. But the Magic Cup is totally worth it. If you win a berth to the US finals, we will fly you and your mentor, maybe Northy, to that US finals, our dime. Last year the US finals were in Seattle. I don't know where they are this year. But I can tell you for the World Finals, we do the same thing. If you make it to that, we will fly you to wherever they are. So in the last few years, it's been, well, this year it was Manhattan. That was kind of the most boring one for Americans. Before that it was Poland, before that it was Egypt, before that it was Paris in France. You know, you can see that kind of trend. This year, if you go in this year's competition, it's Sydney, Australia, which is another really nice place to go. I can attest. So, you know, you can win an all expenses paid trip to Sydney as part of that thing. And you get to interface with students